Stand by. Is this thing on?
Yes, Dan.
Oh, hello.
You're listening to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
This just in.
Breaking news to report.
We are live.
Old newscasters
Can we just say former?
Sure. Former newscasters reunite behind the mic after more than 20 years.
Old news is good news.
Stay tuned.
We are going straight to the top today. Our guest is Kathleen Culver, who goes by Katy Culver, who is the James E. Burgess Chair in Journalism Ethics and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication and director of the Center for Journalism Ethics. When I was a student in the early 1990s, Katy Culver was my advisor in the J-School. And Katy Culver, we are absolutely honored to have you with us today. Welcome to Old News.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So you
Great
have
to have
really,
you. So it's your fault, Katy, that Carrie is here today.
that's
Yes,
right.
all my fault.
She
Actually,
guided me too well. Well, you have really risen through the ranks at UW. Can you tell us more about your roles? What does it mean that you are the James E. Burgess Chair in the Journalism Ethics, in Journalism Ethics, and your role at the center?
Yeah, so I've had a long career here in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, including dating to when I was an advisor as a graduate student, which is when we met. And I've had a number of different roles here, including serving as what's known as a teaching faculty member, eventually becoming a tenure track faculty member, earning tenure. And now I'm also director of the school overall, not just director of the Center for Journalism Ethics. So a lot of hats going on for me.
Wow.
I think my day-to-day work, is so fulfilling because I get to do things that I think have an impact on the world. So I get to, of course, first and foremost, teach students. That's a huge honor for me. And then in the Center for Journalism Ethics, what we try to do is be a bridge between news media and the publics that they're striving to serve. Between academic research and industry practice, trying to help make things as grounded as we possibly can in ethics and integrity.
Outside of your time in academia, before that, you obviously cut your teeth as a journalist, right? So was that your first career, journalism, or did you do something even before that?
No, my very first career was babysitting, of course.
Yes, like many. That
Mine
are
was
paper
newspaper.
routes. Yeah.
Paper route. Yep.
I went to the J-School because I wanted to be the kind of hardest of hard news reporters. I was a police and courts reporter for the then Milwaukee Sentinel and a general assignment for the Sentinel, but focused a lot on police. And then for a small newspaper in Illinois. And then I came back and got my master's and PhD focused on media law. So the law has always been an interesting part of my career. And I teach that class now, our media law class. So if there's a through line through my professional career, it's really that interest in law and the impact of justice in people's lives.
Where did that come from?
I did have a detour. After grad school. I worked in marketing for UW Health for a time, which was really fascinating and gave me the opportunity to learn digital skills that were, this is how old I am. People didn't have Google when I was doing this work.
Yeah,
we know
it's a
that
lot
feeling.
easier now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So where did your passion for justice and the law come from? Did that develop when you were a police reporter?
No, actually, so I had been doing some work as what's called a stringer. So when you, a news organization, you're not employed by them, you're not an intern, you're not a staff reporter, but you do correspondent work for them. And so I had been covering, generally that's usually about breaking news, quite often about crime. And so I had developed an interest in it, but it was really when I took an internship at the Sentinel in the fall semester and then came back in the spring semester and took a media law course. That's where it really sort of lit my mind on fire.
So back in those days, there was two Milwaukee newspapers. Things have changed so much. That was the evening paper was the Sentinel, correct? No. The Journal was the Sentinel, or the Journal was the afternoon, and the Sentinel was the morning. So, were you a Milwaukee girl originally, or did it just?
Grew up in Shorewood, Wisconsin, with my parents were Journal subscribers. We had a Sentinel newspaper box right outside our driveway
Yep.
in good old Shorewood, Wisconsin. And true story, when I went to work for the Sentinel as an intern and then as a reporter, my parents would not change their subscription. They stayed loyal Journal subscribers, did not subscribe to the Sentinel. But my mom's bridge club would cut my articles out and mail them to her. So she at least got
So
to
she
see
got to see them. Thank
That's
goodness.
hilarious. That is loyal. You have really been focusing also on digital media and the impact of digital media on journalism in general. How have you helped bridge that gap for your students over the years?
Well, gosh, in new
Yeah,
ways every single year. I
right.
think really one of the foundational elements of our curriculum here in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication is adaptability, is helping our students develop skills that can carry them across careers and through technologies as they develop. So like I said, no Google, no Facebook when we launched this curriculum, and now we're trying to figure out how how the TikTok algorithm is affecting people's perceptions of news. So
Mhm.
those digital skills are definitely important, but we are not tool focused here because the tool is going to change from one year to the next. There was a
Mhm.
time that every news organization was going to do a pivot to video because Facebook recommended it, and then it turned out to be monstrously unsuccessful. So we don't teach to the tool.
Mhm.
We teach to the audience and what the goal of the communication is, and then pick the tool that best meets the challenge.
Hmm.
So it's fair to say you're teaching kind of how to develop content as opposed to how to develop, how to distribute basically. I mean, because digital media is basically just the way it's distributed, right? I mean, social media, it used to be TV, used to be radio. I mean, is it one of the biggest changes in the way journalism has been delivered I mean, there's the printing press, there's broadcasting, and then there's this, digital media. It's just the way it's distributed, right?
It's the way it's distributed. There are also larger questions. I'll use social media as an example.
Mhm.
The algorithms that lie behind, so the things that deliver your Facebook newsfeed to you, or what you're receiving on Twitter/X, or the Instagram ad. So the algorithms that are delivering that to you, we have some pretty solid evidence that those are driven by some fairly dark emotions. So we are more likely to spend time on a message if it triggers anger, or if it triggers conflict in some
Mhm.
way, and that can be very, very destructive for news. So if we're chasing hits and clicks, because we can now measure things that we didn't used to be able to measure, that might drive more conflict in our narrative and more darkness in our coverage. And we have to be very, very careful about that. So the platforms are not just platforms for delivery, they also have multiple effects on the things we do and need to take into consideration.
That's
Right.
so
Very
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, things that we did not have to worry about when we were working in news together in Madison, because that's like the new thing when we were there was, oh, we have a website now. And people would email us if they wanted to contact us. And even that was like, ooh, we have email. And then we might type a story into the website. But there wasn't that immediacy of, constantly having the feedback, let alone algorithms. I mean, it was just a plain old website.
Mhm.
It's so different.
Yes, the world
Well,
has changed enormously.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the danger is you're just getting information, not just getting information, but you're getting a lot of information that is targeted to you. And like you said, those those dark angels that we carry around with us, as opposed to, it's kind of like the opinion page on steroids. It feels like to me like, I mean, a lot of us would pick our newspapers based on how we aligned with the news. Like you said, your parents were Journal Sentinel or Journal readers.
Mhm.
And then the Sentinel was kind of a little bit different political viewpoint. So people kind of picked based on where they lied, but now it's kind of like forced on you, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. One of the things that we need to be concerned about right now is our tendency to seek out that which reinforces what we already believe.
Mhm.
My parents were very conservative and yet subscribed to the Journal, whose editorial page was quite liberal.
Yeah, that's true. Good point.
So the
Yeah,
Sentinel was the
interesting.
more conservative paper.
Yeah.
They received exposure to editorials that they, would quite often vociferously disagree with.
Huh.
But now we have a greater opportunity than we ever have to sink into our own little silos of, okay, everybody thinks what I think about issue X. And so I'm seeking out information that just reinforces. And that's quite dangerous. The two biggest things that when I give talks publicly and people say, well, what should I be doing to be, better informed? And I say two things. One, if you're on social media and you feel an emotion, pause and move to something else. If something really angers you, don't spend time on it, don't share it, pause, move on to something else, and let the emotion dissipate, and then decide whether this is an issue you're really going to care about. And then the other thing is, a really good practice day to day is, if you're using a laptop or a desktop computer, change the home screen for your web browser. When you open up your web browser, change it to a different news outlet every week, so that you're just getting that little eyeball exposure to something different. Because, if you are such a dedicated viewer of MSNBC and that's your homepage and you're getting fed the information that you agree with already, change it up. Try something that's a little bit different.
Right. Yeah. I agree with
Interesting.
that.
Yeah. What do you teach students about how things have changed? I mean, you mentioned the news silos. It's like the stations have shifted so dramatically. And in the past, you would watch the news, you would hope it was factual, and then if something was an opinion, that was an editorial. I mean, it was like, newsflash, this isn't editorial, this is my opinion. It was not shrouded in, a news piece. And I feel like that has really disappeared, where it's like everything is an opinion now, maybe with some facts sprinkled in. What is your perspective about that?
Well, I think that's a bit of an overstatement. I think if you were to do a content analysis of local news, you would find that it's really not opinion driven in the
Yeah.
main.
Well,
In
and
the
I'm
main,
thinking more national. I do
yeah,
feel like
especially if you're
local
talking
has,
about the
yeah.
evening day part on cable, I would not really call news anymore.
Right.
You know,
It's
Entertainment.
packaged to look like news.
yeah, it's just not something that I really pay much attention to at all, I would say. So I do think that it's important for people to have an understanding of how, what many people call mainstream news media are trying to do, trying to present news that is neutral in nature. They're not taking a side. I think that is something that we're seeing a generational shift a bit. So younger reporters are pushing on concepts like objectivity and neutrality, and some of their, prior generations of the newsroom are saying, no, that's advocacy, that's not journalism, and there's definitely a tension there. You saw it with coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, where you had some people saying you cannot have Black Lives Matter as part of your Twitter bio if you're a journalist, because that's a political statement. And then journalists saying, how is that a political statement? It's about human. It's like saying I support human rights. Like, who opposes human rights, right? So there's definitely a generational tension there that we're seeing play out.
It's I don't know how to phrase this, but it's hard as somebody who's a little older now. I'm in my 50s, and I grew up on newspapers, and I grew up on watching local TV news, and the three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. Well, and then Fox came in at one point. And so I still tend to gravitate to those news sources as legitimate news sources. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I still feel like it's important to get a little feel of all of those, some of the major newspapers. And like you said before, I always encourage other people to do that. Am I okay? I mean, am I on the right track to do that? Because there are a lot of people like me, I worked in the business, but I still trust those sources more than I would trust, say, a Vox News or BuzzFeed or something like that on my news feed. Is that safe to
Yeah.
assume that I'm getting a little bit better journalism at those sources?
Yeah, well, so it's
Assuming is never good, right?
multi-dimensional answer, which is going to be, I apologize, probably a little long. But I would say, BuzzFeed has abandoned its news division, so I would not turn to it for any news. But back when they had a news division, it was quite well done. Vox is an outlet that comes at its work with a particular point of view, and they're very transparent about that. I think their
True.
work is excellent. I consume a great deal of Vox content, particularly their podcasts. Are great. They're coming at it with a transparent point of view. And that's, to me, is the most important thing. So is the news outlet trying to be neutral? If they're not trying to be neutral, are they letting you know that? Are they being upfront about that point of view? And I think Vox is an example of something that is quite good at that. Vice, I think, also tries to be transparent, but they're more about having an edge. And so I have struggled a little bit more with whether that's actually transparent. But look, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, I'm a big fan. I'm a subscriber to all three, but they have problems. They make mistakes. There are biases in their coverage. And I don't mean in just kind of the left-right binary way, that whole, mainstream media are all liberal. I don't mean it like that. I think that's a false binary. But there are biases that come in all over the place. One of the examples I use all the time is that nurses are the most trusted of our healthcare professions and also the most populous of our healthcare professions in the United States. But nurses are quoted in a little bit less than 2% of healthcare coverage. That's a bias. It's a bias that I think has a number of explanations, including nurses' reticence to serve as sources, but also a bias toward authority, and that we see physicians as the authority in the healthcare system. And that can be a real problem. When in COVID coverage, for instance, boy, I mean, if you were in rural Wisconsin and you had a COVID outbreak, we have a severe shortage of physicians in those communities, nurses and advanced practice nurses. They are healthcare in those communities. So if you are overlooking them in your coverage, that's a real problem in serving those communities. So I think, yes, there are what I would call trustworthy sources, but we still have to be skeptical consumers. We still have to ask, how do they know that? What are the sources? How can I verify? Media literacy is a critically important skill.
It's interesting. That's an interesting. So basically, you need to be discerning all the time when you're reading something or watching something. I always tell that to my kids, who probably don't consume hardly any news anymore, sadly. But you're always telling them, like, check the sources, check who said it, why they said it, all of that kind of thing, and even those of us who think we know news have to do that too. And the people who are reporting it need to do it probably a little bit better at times too.
Yeah, absolutely. Your kids may actually be consuming more news than you think.
Well, you're right. You're right. They are just differently than I do.
Exactly. A video gets shared. There's a TikTok user who is it TikTok or Instagram? I think it might be Instagram. She's reading the New York Times. She's right. Her reels are her reading an interesting story. So they're consuming it in different ways. When people say, I get my news from social media, I say, really? Because I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is producing news. I think what you're getting is an NBC report on a medical breakthrough that happens to show up in your TikTok feed. So, but then also, those of us who have done news for a long time, we ought to be pretty critical about that as well, because, I did some work with people who work in addiction medicine, and they're very, very critical of news media and the stigma that often gets attached to substance use disorder. And, why is it that we run a story about someone being arrested for their fifth DWI? Why is that newsworthy? But these experts would say, look, if you're being arrested for your fifth OWI, DWI, drunk driving offense, you have an addiction, like you have substance use, you need treatment. But we don't see that come through in much news coverage. So we ought to be skeptical across the board, even with that, we would think overall to be trustworthy.
Switching gears a little bit, could you tell us about, I know you just wrapped up a semester at UW-Madison. Could you tell us about the courses that you were teaching and some of the content that you were teaching the students?
Yeah, so I teach pretty much my solo class now is our media law course. I've also taught magazines and our introductory class and all sorts of fun stuff. But right now I'm really focused on the media law class. It's certainly fascinating time, fascinating time to be doing that. We've campus protests, have had some other controversies unfold. You have a former president of the United States on trial. So questions of like, why aren't there cameras in the courtroom? Why can't we see this sort of thing? Those all come up. So it's really, it's a very heady time to be teaching this class. And I just love how enthusiastic and engaged the students are. They love tackling tough questions. This generation gets a bad rap, like, oh, they're just addicted to their phones. They don't care about anything. That is not what I see in my classroom. I see some really, committed, dedicated students in the main.
That's great.
Well, and as part of that, as part of that course, do they then go down and do you have them go observe what's happening on the mall and check that out? And do they have to write up reports on that or what's happening?
Not for my class, but if you wanted to see a nuanced portrait of protests on campus, I would strongly suggest following the student newspapers on that campus, because the Columbia Spectator, the Daily Cardinal, and Badger Herald here, all of them just had really, for being a crew of 20-year-olds, they had some really fantastic coverage. I thought it was thorough. And in fact, a colleague and I are hoping to do research on how it differed from mainstream news coverage and its framing.
Oh, that's good to hear. And we're recording this interview on May 15th. I was reading that on the 13th, that's when an agreement was reached between the university and the protesters that they were going to disband the encampment. How did the protests affect you, or did they, as in Vilas Hall? I know you're close, not like right in the library mall, but you're close by. Did you ever have issues like getting into the building or anything like that?
No, our protests overall were peaceful. They did not block access. There was always one lane open around the protests for students to navigate campus. So thankfully it didn't turn into, the taking over of buildings or anything like that. I think the principal way that it affects me is that, my students and my faculty and staff colleagues feel this very deeply. This is a horrible situation in Gaza, and October 7th was a horrible situation. Students, really genuinely in pain all the way around this. And so I think for me, the biggest effect is trying to show care for students and try to help people see other perspectives. There's been a lot of narrative that portrays these protests in a particular way, or overstates or understates, the interest of students who are disturbed by the protests. And I think we just have a duty of care to help people feel that their views are respected. This is an incredibly deep and complex situation with a massive and tumultuous history. And it's not really about tents on Library Mall in Madison, Wisconsin. I did not want things to be reduced to the tents. We're talking about, a massive human toll, in terms of loss of life, in terms of injury, in terms of, distrust. And so, you know, green Coleman tents got a bunch of news coverage, but that's not ultimately what this is about. And we have to really work to remind everybody of that.
Yeah. So much nuance that it doesn't always come across. I'm sure I would love to now read the Badger Herald and the Daily Cardinal, and they're much more accessible to people like me now than they were back in the day, you know, where I can go online and take a look at them now, as opposed to in the old days that I had to go down to campus or know somebody who had a copy of it to get it to me. So that's one of the beauties of the digital age, I guess, is the accessibility of you know, product like that, so to speak. So what are the numbers like in the journalism school now in terms of, you know, we hear a lot of people say, oh, you know, people aren't going into journalism. They're not going into things like that anymore. But is that true?
No, it's not true. So our major has, it's not purely journalism. So at the undergraduate level, we have a good majority of students who are, more than a majority, who are in strategic communication. So they're interested in advertising, public relations, integrated marketing. And then at the graduate level, we have a professional track master's in journalism. But then our research masters and PhD, they're really looking at mass communication and not in professional contexts, but in terms of, you know, theories and methods in health communication, political communication, journalism studies. I mean, it's just like our graduate students are doing projects too many for me to count. In law, you know, in ethics, of course.
Yeah, right.
So the school is doing very well. We're very healthy, a lot of interest in the major. I would say I do hear from parents who are visiting with their high school seniors, like, is this something that my kid really should be doing? I understand there's a lot of job loss in journalism, and there is. The loss of labor in journalism is a big threat. It is a threat to communities. It is a threat to democracy. I will not understate it. But this major is a gateway major to pretty much anything. I mean, if you can take in information, digest it, you know, sift, winnow, and then relay information out to other people, those are skills that work whether you're a doctor, an astronomer, a lawyer, a nurse. I mean, like, those skills translate into anything. So I think we as citizens should be concerned about the loss of jobs in journalism, but as students, this major still offers, you know, doorways into so many, many things.
That theme has definitely come up in this podcast. I mean, we didn't really know where we'd be headed when we started the podcast, but that theme has been a common occurrence. That just the other day we were talking with Ken Syke, and he was an anchor. He was in sports in Madison. Then he went on to be a public information officer for the school district and worked for Edgewood College. And that's exactly what he was saying, is that, you know, the journalism majors and people who have those skills are really equipped to go and do, you know, once you have the skills, then you can learn the nuance on the job or learn about the education piece on the job. But it just prepares you for really anything that you want to do.
Yep. I am so proud of it. I put 2 of my kids through it. So
Oh, very good.
yes.
And are they working journalists now, or are they doing?
Yeah, so the oldest is 27 and is doing some freelance writing. And then our middle went into finance, and so did not come through the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, sadly. But that's okay. Everybody has their different talents. And then our youngest is she'll be a senior next year in our program. So she's going to go into sports marketing, I believe. Sports, just toying with sports reporting, but she's thinking sports marketing.
Wow.
Well, congratulations. That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to touch on something you talked about a little bit. Yeah, we have the loss of journalists. That's one thing. But then you talked about, like, for lack of a better term, there's many news deserts now. There's places where people can't get news, or we've lost news. You know, I live in the city of Sun Prairie, where we still have a local newspaper, but it has struggled. You know, it has struggled, you know, financially, and so what we see oftentimes is a lot of those little newspapers, and it's happening in television as well. They're gobbled up by bigger organizations, and I'm curious to know, what do you think that does to the state of journalism? Kind of the I would call it the monopolization of journalism in some ways.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull out a few different strands. So one, with news deserts, it's a big concern. And one of the things that we're starting to see in research is that if or when a community drops into becoming a news desert, it can tend to polarize because the news is not local, the news is national. So instead of paying attention to your local mayoral race or your school board race, you don't have that weekly coming and telling you who's running and doing interviews with the candidates. You're paying more attention to the presidential race because your
Right.
politics is nationalized. And
And
golly,
we see that in turnout, right? We see that in the
look
election
at that
turnouts.
polarization. Yikes.
Yep. Yep.
So that's a real concern. And there can be because of the national news agenda, it can be an overemphasis on politics as opposed to the other things that people care about in their communities, money, family, safety, health,
School.
entertainment,
Yeah.
look at how much local news coverage of youth sports draws people together. Like the photos of the homecoming parade
Yeah.
make you proud to live in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And so that brings us together, whether, you support this, a conservative economic policy and Carrie supports a liberal economic policy. You're together looking at the photo of the homecoming parade, or you're probably at the homecoming parade, and that reinforces your sense of being together in this community. When you don't have that outlet to pull people together, that can be a real problem. It is a real problem. I also think that some of the answers to that can pose problems as well. So, people saying, well, we lost our local weekly newspaper, but we've created this Facebook group where everybody gets together in the Facebook group and we post things and we share, or we're all together on the Nextdoor app, and that gives us a sense of community. I don't know if you've ever been on Nextdoor, but if you want to talk about overhyping crime as part of information technology, Nextdoor is it. I mean, like when someone knocked on someone's door and they didn't recognize you. So, as much as I would say if it bleeds, it leads is a problem for mainstream news, it can be an even larger problem when people are kind of running their own information ecology. And then there are, I would just say, some bad actors out there. So people who are trying to look like news, but they're actually partisanship. So, paid posts by lobbyists and the like, and then calling themselves, say, what is the name of the Sun? Is it the Sun Prairie Star?
The Star, yep.
Yeah. So they all of a sudden are out there saying, we're the Sun Prairie Tribune, but they're not trying to be what the Star tries to be. They're not trying to present neutral community information. They're trying to get you to vote in a particular way. And I have no problem with people having persuasive partisan websites. Not a problem at all. Just be transparent about it. Be upfront that this is who we are and this is why we are doing what we're doing. If you want to persuade, be honest. Don't try to trick people.
Yeah. What about that industrialization of the news business, so to speak?
Yes. So consolidation is a big problem. Now, there are some, Gannett, for instance, has its biggest footprint in the state in terms of coverage is the state of Wisconsin, and that can have some benefits when, when those news organizations can use their ownership structure to report on an issue affecting the whole state. The Gannett, Wisconsin papers did a really phenomenal multi-year look into the series is called Kids in Crisis. It's
great
mental health and
stuff.
suicide among young people. Wisconsin is over-indexed on that. We have, for our population, way too high a rate. And they did just terrific reporting on that and bringing people. They held community forums. They had over 1,000 people show up to these things. They had a day of action at the Capitol. to sort of get legislators to hear these stories and work on funding for mental health in particularly in rural communities. So that kind of collaboration can be really, really helpful. And if you were 12 completely separately owned newspapers, you wouldn't be doing that kind of collaboration. Back before the state of Wisconsin was tracking opioid deaths, same thing. Those papers got together, they went to all 72 counties, looked through medical records, and created a database of overdose deaths for over a 5-year period, I think, when the state wasn't doing it. That's tremendous service. However, we're talking about these big organizations, so that's great, but we're talking about organizations that are publicly traded, and ultimately the bottom line matters, and that leads to these cuts that can result in things like a centralized copy editing desk. So rather than having a local copy editor who knows that it's pronounced Doty Street, not Dottie Street, you have someone far flung who doesn't understand the community, and so mistakes can come in. So there are a lot, I'm one of those people who says, look, I am very supportive of the old business model in news. I subscribe to 5 paid outlets. One of them local to Madison, 1 regional, the Journal Sentinel, and then 3 national. And I also pay with my advertising eyeballs as well. But there are new models that we should pay attention to as well, like nonprofit news, Wisconsin Watch, the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism being a good example.
Doing some really good stuff.
Yep. And so I think, we don't have to preserve the old way. It doesn't have to be that there are 3 competing stations, TV stations in Madison. Maybe that's not what we have 20 years from now, but we better all pray that we have some sort of reliable information ecosystem that includes journalism that sets out to find accurate facts, relay them in the correct context, without fear or favor. That's what we need so that we can make decisions on politics, on who we're going to vote for and why, but also on money and safety and family and all of those things that matter to us within a community.
You've done a lot of research, and switching gears a little bit. A lot of the research, I was looking at your list of papers on your website that you've published in many, many publications, and the theme of drones kept coming up, and drones and privacy. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so, drones in our airspace, a lot of people think of drones in the military context, that sort of lethal context, but, if you have a 13-year-old kid or grandkid, you probably got them a drone for Christmas sometime recently. And one of the questions that I have had as technology develops in news is, what is the impact of these emerging technologies on journalism practice? And what are the ethical implications of that? And so, I did some research with focus groups of citizens about, so if your local news station is using a drone or the newspaper is using a drone, what are your concerns about privacy, about safety? And I think that that's something that news media could do more of, having community conversations to understand, like we can tend in newsrooms to think that we're making the right decisions for the right reasons. And then we don't tell anybody what those decisions are or what the reasons were. And that can damage trust in news. The more open we are to hearing public feedback and sharing about our information, our decision making, the more trust goes up. There's a great organization called Trusting News that I recommend checking out. They do research into how we can rebuild that trust, or build it for the first time, not even rebuild.
Build.
Yes, exactly. And so that was what my work on drones, like how should newsrooms approach this? What kind of internal guidelines could they have? Not these sort of FAA licensing and rules sort of stuff, but what should guide your practice internally? And that's, that also applies to using sensors, scraping data. There are all sorts of technologies that present ethical conundrums.
The Ring doorbell itself is one of those situations where you could be being recorded any minute you're walking down the street.
I
It's
know now I whisper, like if I'm with someone, it's like I just assume I'm going to be on their camera. So I'm like, in the olden days, you would just be like chat, chat, chat about private things. And, now it's like, I just think who's recording me now?
Yep, and should news media be using those recordings when someone does capture something on a ring? How, like, should they be compensated for that? Should they not? Should we run it and before we've had time to vet it? Should we not? And by the way, we're probably almost at time. We haven't even touched on artificial intelligence, which is just
Right.
a
oh yeah,
huge.
that's a whole nother
if you have time,
podcast.
well, if you have time, you can touch on it. We have time.
Yes. I mean, artificial intelligence is going to challenge trust in news. People are worried that, what can I believe? What is real? What is not? And so every single newsroom should be thinking about this right now. They should be bringing in feedback from outside, from audience, from citizens in their community, and being as clear as possible about when they'll use these tools and when they won't. Trusting news, as I mentioned, I don't want to overstate it because it was very early data, but early data from a study that they did indicated that labels showing that AI was used in reporting on a story actually lowered trust levels. And so we need to do more research to see what kind of transparency helps, what hinders, and why. And I think, the questions, clearly we know that a local news station should not go on to, let's see, what did Google just announce something new today? They announced,
Little elevator music here.
Yes. VEO is their newest text to video tool. So
VEO.
VEO, I believe.
Okay.
I can say create a video of a 54-year-old white man walking down State Street and encountering protesters.
Oh my.
And it will generate video. It won't be perfect. There'll be things that are wrong with it. You will know that it is AI created just because of some of the oddness to it. If you're looking at it carefully. If you're looking at it on a cell phone really quickly and it's shared in a little 10-second snippet, you wouldn't be able to tell. And so generative AI, AI is about way more than ChatGPT or this video generation tool. This is generative AI that I'm talking about. AI exists in all sorts of other ways in your life and search and that sort of thing. But with generative AI, I think this is a moment for news media to establish themselves as honest brokers, as the people who are presenting you the real protest video and real people walking down State Street, because this other stuff, can't necessarily be believed. But then there are other minute questions. So if you are doing a daily news podcast and your anchor who does the podcast makes a minor error, but it's actually a fact error, and you're in post-production and she's not available. She is on a plane heading out on vacation, but you still need to drop this podcast because it's timely. And she has said, the verdict of not guilty, blah, 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 but actually the verdict was guilty. So normally you would say, oh, she slipped up, so I'm going to pull not out of there, right? I'm going to edit that out because she made a mistake. Well, what if she said guilty, but it's supposed to be not guilty? Now you have built a repository of AI generation tools for the voices of all of your talent at the station. So you can generate her voice saying not guilty instead of guilty. Is that okay? Is that ethical? Can you do that? What if it's a sentence, not a word? What if it's correcting something where you don't like her tone, but it isn't a factual error? There are all of these questions are going to be coming up in newsrooms over and over and over again. So the time to start thinking about them is yesterday.
Wow, fascinating.
It's interesting because I was just speaking with I was having coffee with a friend of mine who is still a photographer in the TV news business, and he was talking about how they were having this discussion about, a lot of times in TV news you grab file tape. We need shots of people, who are overweight walking on, State Street or something like that, and he
That's the
said,
classic
and
one.
now,
Ethical
and
problems
right,
with that too.
yeah, totally, absolutely, or smoking or whatever. And he said now there's a lot of talk of that could possibly be generated by AI down the road, where you're not pulling file tape, you're pulling AI generated non-existent people, and it's kind of like, oh, that's a slippery slope to me. It's a scary thought. Where does it
definitely is.
end?
And it depends on what the audience knows about it and how they can
Right.
factor in that information into their credibility judgments. But I mean, there are people all the time will complain to me about file footage. Oh, they're doing a story about UW-Madison, and they've got footage of student feet walking up Bascom Hill. And it's
Right.
February, and the footage has leaves on the ground. Has
Right.
fall leaves on the ground. So it doesn't
Right.
match.
Yeah,
So
right.
that affects credibility too. But AI is going to
Yes.
present so many, many, many questions for looking.
Yeah, just this is such a small aspect of it, but at least when we would use file 20 plus years ago, we always put file as a super and it said file. So it's like, you knew if you're watching it, it's like, that's old stuff. We didn't shoot it today that says file. I wonder if they'll be identifying AI generated or, having some kind of identifying marker to at least acknowledge we made this stuff up.
Yes, and Google is also at work on tools for that, such that watermarks are embedded so that you'll be able to, people can, at some point, I believe the idea is you could have an app on your phone or on your smart TV that lets you know, that like pops a message that this has an AI watermark on it. It's just a fascinating world that is moving so quickly I can barely keep up. I wish I was 27, not 57.
Well, I gotta say, I'm at the age now where I think I want to come and audit your classes, because
I
there's
was
things
thinking
that
the same thing.
I need to learn so much, and it's always dangerous as you get older to lose touch with some of that stuff that's changing, and it's changing so quickly. So I feel like, that is something I want to do down the road, is audit classes like yours, because boy, if you don't know what's happening, you get left behind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, hey, we've taken up a lot of your time, Katy. Really appreciate. This has been so fascinating to talk with you today. I could listen to you all day.
Yes.
Oh, well.
Thank
Well,
you
you're welcome
so
to come
much.
and audit a class at any point. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to chat about these issues because they are so very important.
They are.
Thanks a lot.
To hear your perspective and have your knowledge is just invaluable. So thank you so much.
All right. And best of luck with the podcast.
Thanks.
You. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
That's old news for now.
Join us next time.